Today I'm investigating some of the most blatant lies ever told by the church. I'll be exploring the mystery behind Jesus' death, his life, the languages he spoke, and a prehistoric connection with the Old Testament. Where did Jesus go between his death and resurrection? Where was Jesus for the 3 days between his death and his resurrection? Did he go to hell? Did he ascend to heaven in spirit form? Or was he in a sort of murky limbo? Furthermore, what's the significance of 3 days? Why wasn't Jesus resurrected immediately? I know it's a lot of questions in the first 10 seconds of the video, but don't worry, I'm going to answer every single one of them. And yes, by the end you'll be in total shock. I'll start by telling you what the Bible says. There are 3 main passages in the Bible that give clues as to what happened to Jesus after he died. In the book of Acts, it says Jesus was not abandoned to Hades, which was what the Bible called hell. There is no real hell in the Bible, but it does mention Hades as the realm of the dead several times. The book of Acts suggests that Jesus went to hell but didn't remain there. He only visited. In the book of Peter, there's a passage that claims Jesus went to Hades to preach to the spirits imprisoned there. But which spirits? 1 Peter chapter 3 verse 20 says that it's those who disobeyed long ago when God waited patiently in the days of Noah while the ark was being built. This is where things take a kind of unusual turn. Biblical scholars have never been able to agree on what the passage means. It seems obvious that Jesus Christ went to Hades to speak with people who were alive during the days of Noah. But were these human sinners killed by the flood, or the fallen angels responsible for creating the Nephilim? Nobody knows. The third important passage comes from the book of Ephesians. It refers to Jesus leading a host of captives. Bible scholars think this could be the final piece of the puzzle. Jesus went to Hades, spoke with those who disobeyed God in the times of Noah, and then led their souls to heaven. Jesus sacrificed himself, allowing him to apply some reverse damnation to the souls of hell. You might still have some questions, like if Jesus went to hell and then heaven, what was the point of the resurrection? Jesus Christ was preemptively resurrected. What I mean is that according to Christian legend, all the dead people of the world will be resurrected on Judgment Day. This is why Christians don't allow themselves to be cremated. If they don't have any physical remains, they can't come back to life. No resurrection, no judgment, no eternal salvation. Although that's a bit of a paradox. If a person's spirit can't go to heaven because their body can't be resurrected, how do they instantly go to hell when they die? And if everyone is waiting for Judgment Day, does that mean everyone who dies before the apocalypse just hangs out in limbo? Maybe you can help me solve some of these philosophical conundrums. In the meantime, I have one more piece of information for you regarding Jesus' death. It's this last piece of info that I've been saving to blow your socks off. In ancient Persia, it was believed that when someone died, their soul didn't immediately go on to its final place of rest. The soul lingered near the person's dead body for 3 days. Then on the 3rd day, it left for the land of the dead. This is almost certainly where Jesus' resurrection story comes from. It was ripped off from far older Persian afterlife beliefs. I wanted to give a big shout out to William House and Nazari Roberto. Thanks so much for watching and supporting OE. If you're new here, be sure to subscribe and join the family. Cain and Abel, Homo sapiens and Neanderthals. One of the oldest stories in the world might have its roots in a story that goes back to the origin of the human species. I'm talking about the tale of Cain and Abel, one of the most notorious parts of the Old Testament. A recent archaeological dig in Iraq could be connected to these ancient brothers. If you're not familiar with the story of Cain and Abel, here's the scoop. Adam and Eve got expelled from the Garden of Eden. They hadn't paid the rent on time, they had won too many parties, and God kicked them to the curb. They were stuck out in the wild with their 2 sons. The firstborn was Cain and the second was Abel. As anybody with a sibling knows, sibling rivalries can be tough. Cain was ambitious, growing up to become the very first farmer. His younger brother Abel wasn't as interested in pioneering new technologies. He was a simple man who wanted to live a simple life. While Cain was terraforming the virgin planet, Abel went about collecting his food like a traditional hunter-gatherer or shepherd. But then God interfered. The brothers decided to each give God an offering. Abel offered God a lamb. Cain gave God a sheaf of wheat. God favored Abel's offering, and in a fit of jealousy, Cain killed his brother. And that, my friends, was the first murder in the world. But how much of this story is true? Many scholars today suspect that the stories in the Old Testament are mostly metaphorical. The book is full of metaphors sprinkled into ancient pieces of history that have been lost to time. For example, the Garden of Eden was likely a real paradise in southern Iraq, but the tale of Adam and Eve is probably just that, a story. The flood was real, most likely the result of an asteroid impact, but the story of Noah again is just a story. Following this logic, what real event was the inspiration behind Cain and Abel? A new theory has gripped the scientific community. It's possible that Cain and Abel represent Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthals. They both descended from a common father, the metaphorical Adam, or the elder hominid genus. Cain, the elder brother, represents the elder species, Homo sapiens. You and I, or rather our ancestors, appeared more than 200,000 years ago. Abel, the younger brother, represents the younger species. Neanderthals officially emerged around 130,000 years ago. And there are other connections too. Humans were likely the first ones to come up with the idea of planned agriculture. On the other hand, Neanderthals relied on hunting and herding. And let's not forget a little bit of gathering. But did human beings really kill Neanderthals? And does the Old Testament retell the story through Cain and Abel? Scientists have never been able to figure out how Neanderthals went extinct, but it may have been violent. Archaeologist Stephen Churchill from Duke University uncovered a murdered Neanderthal in Iraq. The Neanderthal died after being stabbed in the ribs with a spear made by a human about 50,000 years ago. Maybe the Old Testament really is a history book, only its history is way older than the church would have us believe. The truth behind everyone's favorite saint. Saint Christopher is not who you think he is. What I'm about to tell you will forever alter your opinion of one of America's favorite saints. You might never wear the St. Christopher medal ever again. If you didn't already know, Christopher is the patron saint of travelers. You may even know someone in your life who clings to their St. Christopher medallion for dear life, swearing it protects them. But what else can I tell you about Christopher? Well, St. Christopher was allegedly 7 foot 5 inches tall, which would make him a giant. And plot twist, his real name wasn't even Christopher. He was called Reprobus and was a Canaanite. The myth says that Reprobus worked for the king of Canaan, but he wasn't very happy with his position in life. One day he abruptly decided to abandon his post. He ventured off on a spiritual quest, hoping to find a greater king to serve. On his journey, he had all kinds of misadventures. Then he stumbled upon a wise old hermit. The hermit said if Reprobus wished to find a king worthy of his service, he needed to help people cross a treacherous river. So he did just that. Reprobus hung out by a raging river and helped people cross so that they didn't drown. Then came along a child whom Reprobus carried across the river on his shoulders. When they reached the other side, he told the kid that he had never carried such a heavy weight in his life. The child told Reprobus it was because he had carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. This was the end of Reprobus's quest. In that moment, he realized that he had been serving the greatest king of all the whole time, God Almighty. At least that's the story the church likes to tell. Reprobus became Christopher because the name means Christ-bearer. Christopher is, next to Jesus, one of the holiest names in Christianity. It literally has Christ in it. You may have heard the rumor that St. Christopher was stripped of his sainthood in the 1960s during reforms by the Catholic Church. But I'm here to tell you that's not true. He's still a saint, it's just that the church didn't think he was particularly important. In 1969, the church realized their calendar was getting a little crowded with too many saints' days. To clear up some room, the church did what they do best. They started changing things that they didn't see as important anymore. Poor Christopher was crossed off the calendar like an abandoned dentist appointment. He's still a saint, he's just not on the guest list. As for his actual existence, the church refuses to confirm or deny that he was a real person. When the church won't even comment on it, it's safe to say they don't have any proof that St. Christopher was ever a flesh and blood mortal. The English expulsion of the Jewish people. It took 800 years for the church to apologize for the horrible things they did to the Jewish people of England 800 years ago. The church in England kicked off the final solution nearly 1,000 years before Hitler showed up. This little piece of history is not well known to the masses. 2022 marked the 800th anniversary of the Synod of Oxford. This was a set of anti-Semitic decrees that were issued by the church. The decrees forced Jews to wear badges of shame, just like how the Nazis made them wear armbands. The decrees limited Jews to specific occupations. New synagogues were not allowed to be built. It was also the beginning of the blood libel, which led to bloodshed and massacres. The Synod of Oxford was officially held on May 9, 1222 in Oxford's Osney Abbey. Even though the Church of England wasn't around until the 16th century, current leaders of the Church agreed to apologize for what happened following the decrees. What followed was the expulsion of the Jews in July of 1290. Things didn't spiral down the drain as quickly as they did in the years leading to World War II. This was the Middle Ages, so things took longer to unfold. It started with the Synod of Oxford and the persecution. By 1232, Jews were aggressively encouraged to convert to Christianity. In 1253, King Henry issued the Statute of Jewry, in which he attempted to segregate England's Jewish population with even more oppressive laws. Then in 1275, King Edward I issued another statute, placing even more restrictions on Jews. Next came the horrors of 1290. That's when King Edward I issued the Edict of Expulsion. This was a royal decree that made it illegal for any practicing Jew to be within the Kingdom of England. When you think about the history of anti-Semitism, England might not be the first place that comes to mind. Yet it was the first European state to permanently ban Jewish people from their empire. What's even more savage is that they did it on Tisha B'Av, the Jewish holy day commemorating the destruction of Jerusalem. King Edward told his sheriffs that he wanted every last Jew out of the country by November the 1st. And since he gave the order on July 18th, Jewish communities had less than 4 months to pack up and go. This was the culmination of growing anti-Semitism in England over the previous century. And while there weren't any outright massacres, there was quite a lot of death. There were acts of piracy in which Jewish people had their things looted as they tried to flee, resulting in bloodshed. There were also a lot of people who drowned because it was the worst time of year to leave the country. Jewish people were forced onto ramshackle boats and were transported across the English Channel in the middle of storms. You're probably thinking that England's a progressive place. Surely it couldn't have taken the church that long to overturn their decision. But it did. The expulsion remained enforced for the remainder of the Middle Ages. It wasn't overturned until 365 years later, in 1656. That time a woman was pope and the Vatican lied about it. Do you remember that one time that a woman became pope by accident? If not, don't sweat it. It's something the church would rather have everybody forget. But I'm here to remind you. Listen to this story about the scandalous Pope Joan and tell me what you think in the comments. In the year 855 AD, Pope John VIII was elected to take the throne of the papacy. However, Pope John was supposedly a lady who disguised herself as a man and entered into the religious order. Then she slowly rose through the ranks. All the while, she never let anybody catch on that she was not of the male persuasion. Her reign as Pope lasted just over 2 years. The charade went on until her secret was revealed in 858 when she accidentally went into labor. Wait, labor? Oh yes, it turns out that Pope wasn't keeping to her vows of celibacy. She had gotten pregnant and was hiding the baby bump underneath her flowing robes. She had almost gotten away with it, but she couldn't stop her labor from starting during a papal procession. So what happened to our good lady Pope? Legend has it that she died in childbirth, but this isn't confirmed. An alternative legend says that she was tied to the back of a horse, dragged through the streets, and then stoned to death. Either way you shake it, it was a bloody end for history's only girl pope. That's assuming she existed, of course. Her story appeared in the 13th century, written down by Stephen of Bourbon, a famous Dominican friar. She became known as Pope Joan, and by the 14th century she was an accepted part of Vatican history. For a time in the Middle Ages, she appeared on sculptures, in paintings, and even on tarot cards. But then the church cracked its whip. If there's one thing the church hates more than anything else, it's women in their club. These days, historians say that there's no proof at all that Pope Joan ever existed. They say there's no reliable reference of her in the 9th century. Maybe she didn't exist, or maybe this is a classic example of the church burying the truth. Could the church have purposely removed all records of Pope Joan from history to such a degree that even modern historians don't believe in her? Methuselah's insanely long life. People in the Old Testament lived for way longer than people do today. Adam, Noah, Enoch, Lamech, they all lived for hundreds of years. But were they aliens? Or maybe they were related to the Anunnaki or the Egyptian gods who lived for eons? The literal interpretation of long biblical lives is not something the church wants you to know. Nobody in the Bible lived for as long as Methuselah, whose name literally translates to death of sword, which is pretty much the coolest name I've ever heard. Methuselah lived for 969 years. He appears in Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. The book of Genesis claims that he was the son of Enoch, which made him the grandfather of Noah. He lived right up until the flood, dying when Noah built his ark. However, the Bible never says whether Methuselah died from the flood waters or from old age. It's possible that he could have lived to be more than 1,000 years old. Other than being Noah's grandfather, Methuselah doesn't do much in the Bible, unless you're involved in the Mormon Church, in which case Methuselah is a prophet. Now let's get down to the nitty-gritty. Why is Methuselah so old, and what is the church not telling us? One of the most shocking interpretations is that 969 years is an epic mistranslation. When the Bible was originally translated, somebody may have interpreted months as years. Instead of Methuselah living 969 solar years, he lived 969 lunar months. That would have made him 78.5 years old, which is a perfectly acceptable lifespan by all logic. Scholar Ellen Bennett argued that the lifespans in Genesis are in the tenths of years instead of full years. That would mean Methuselah lived to be 96, Adam lived to be 93, and Noah lived to be 95. Suddenly, things start to make a little more sense. Do you think it's possible that the incredible longevity of biblical figures is due to a bad translator? It's entirely possible that the church knows the translation is bad, but they're too embarrassed at this point to do anything. Like the church put their pants on backwards, but now it's too late. They're already walking around in public. Christograms in a Caribbean cave. When you think about the earliest European colonizers of the Americas, the first thing that comes to mind might be religious missionaries trying to convert the natives. What I'm about to tell you could change your whole perception of the first colonizers. A team led by scientists from the British Museum and the University of Leicester discovered a cave on the uninhabited Caribbean island of Mona. Mona is home to more than 70 cave systems. It's considered to be one of the most cavernous places in North America. Nobody lives on it, although Christopher Columbus did claim the island for Spain on his second voyage in 1494. The island is about 40 miles from Puerto Rico. Scientists were looking for evidence of ancient humans, and they found the evidence in a big way. They discovered Latin inscriptions and Christograms drawn on cave walls right next to iconography made by indigenous people. British Museum curator Jago Cooper called the discovery truly extraordinary. Alice Sampson from the University of Leicester said the drawings are proof that the first generations of Europeans were exposed to indigenous worldviews. Europeans were brought into dark caves by natives and were shown their sacred drawings. Then, as a sign of respect, the Europeans drew Christograms on the cave walls. Christograms are letters used to abbreviate Jesus Christ. They were typical of the 16th century, which made the cave carvings easy for scientists to date. I'm not saying that Christianity and the New World got along, because they didn't. They got along about as well as peanut butter and worms on a sandwich. The Spanish Inquisition caused utter devastation in Mexico. Thousands of years of history were burned by conquistadors and priests in Peru. Though ironically, some of the most devoted Catholic countries in the world are in Latin America today. What I'm saying is that the earliest colonizers before the Inquisition and before Europeans fully knew North America existed engaged spiritually with indigenous people. The proof of it is written on Mona's dark cave walls. The church with the head in it. When you walk into a church, the first thing you see likely isn't a severed head. That is, unless you're in Ireland at the St. Peter's Church in Drogheda. If you happen to enter this gorgeous French Gothic house of God, you're going to be forced to look at the blackened, slightly shriveled, and rather hideous head of a dead saint. Leave it to the church to be obsessed with body parts. In a zombie apocalypse, church members would be gathering these things up by the truckload. But just whose head is on display here inside the glass case, looking like it's trapped in a huge golden cage? Well, this is the severed head of Oliver Plunkett, an Irish martyr from the 17th century. In 1975, he became the first new saint in Ireland after almost 700 years. Then, in 1997, he was officially made the Irish patron saint for peace and reconciliation. But that still doesn't explain what his head is doing in a big gold cage. To explain, I need to back up a bit to the 1600s when Oliver became a Catholic priest. It was the middle of the century, and Cromwell's conquest of Ireland was fresh in everybody's minds. Roman Catholic clergymen were being persecuted and often executed. Oliver joined Ireland's first integrated school, a Jesuit college in which Protestant and Catholic students studied together. But Catholics were still largely hated by the community. Oliver found himself on the wrong side of an evil plot to create anti-Catholic hysteria. He was found guilty of high treason and was sentenced to death. On July 1st, 1681, Oliver Plunkett was executed in one of the most horrendous ways imaginable. First he was hanged, then he was drawn and quartered, as if the hanging hadn't been uncomfortable enough. After that, his body parts were spread around the courtyard of St. Giles in the Fields, and a few years later the body parts were exhumed. His head made it to Rome, then back to Ireland. It arrived in Drogheda in 1929, and ever since it's been kept in what sort of looks like a post-apocalyptic trophy case. The many languages of Jesus Christ. When God destroyed the Tower of Babel, he shattered human language into fragments so that people could never work together again. But if that's true, why did Jesus speak at least 3 languages? Jesus Christ spoke Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. He may have also spoken some other languages that he learned while traveling to places like India. And if that sounds interesting to you, stick around. There's more on that coming up. I know what you're thinking. If Jesus was God and therefore omniscient, shouldn't he have spoken all languages? Well, no, because Jesus was divinely human and lived on earth as a human man. Jesus would have only known the languages that he learned during his time as a human being. For years, scholars have bickered over which language Jesus spoke. One of the most notorious arguments came up in 2014. There was a public meeting between Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel's prime minister, and Pope Francis. The Israeli prime minister said, "Jesus was here in this land, he spoke Hebrew." And then Pope Francis interrupted by saying Aramaic. The truth is that Jesus probably spoke both. He was born as a Jew in the Kingdom of Judah at the beginning of the 1st century AD. Aramaic was the most common language spoken in the area at the time. The language originated with the Aramaeans in the 11th century BC. It spread across the world to become just as popular as English is today. However, Jesus likely spoke Hebrew as well. Hebrew was the language of the religious elites, most commonly used by scholars. 2,000 years ago, Hebrew was more like what Latin is today, mostly spoken by librarians in stuffy rooms full of books. This doesn't seem like a big deal, right? So then why did the Pope make such a blunt correction of the Prime Minister in 2014? Because anti-Semitism has been embedded in the Church since its beginning. The Spanish Inquisition wasn't just about witches, it was also about exiling the Jews. The Crusades, which were started by medieval popes, also focused on murdering Jewish communities. The German Crusade of 1096 saw 2,000 Jewish people massacred by mobs of Christians. While you're here, I may as well give you a few more details about the German Crusade. People generally think of the Crusades as being Christian versus Muslim, fighting for control over the Holy Land. But during the First Crusade, Jews were seen as just as evil as Muslims. Christians in France and Germany blamed the Jews for crucifying Jesus. And because there were more Jews in Europe than Muslims, Jewish communities found themselves under fire. In the spring of 1096, knights inspired by the violence of the Crusade began forming mobs in Bohemia, Saxony, and other parts of Germany. These turned into mini-crusades in which actual peasant mobs with pitchforks and torches wiped out entire Jewish populations. In the town of Worms, 800 Jews refused Catholic baptism, and as a result, they were massacred. The examples go on and on. Since the death of Christ, there has been a covert battle unfolding between Christianity and Judaism. Even though Jesus Christ surely spoke Hebrew, the Church doesn't want you to know about it. Quite frankly, they don't even want you to know that Jesus was Jewish. Jesus on a spiritual journey in India. Jesus spoke Aramaic and Hebrew, but he may have spoken an Indian dialect as well. Between the ages of 12 and 30, Jesus Christ may have been on a holy Buddhist pilgrimage far from the Sea of Galilee. One of the craziest things about the story of Jesus is that it has a giant plot hole in its center. The Bible goes into detail about what happened to Jesus between the age of 0 and 12, but then there's a huge gap and the story picks back up with Jesus being 30 years old. So what in the world happened to those 18 years? It's a question that haunts scholars at night. There's no official biblical explanation for what Jesus was doing for nearly 20 years, but he may have been in India. I even have a potential piece of proof that I'd like to tell you about. In 1887, Russian war correspondent Nicholas Notovich was living in the Hemis monastery of Ladakh. During his time there, he learned of a mysterious document called Life of Saint Issa, Best of the Sons of Men. The document was all about a curious youth who arrived in India from Jerusalem to improve himself and study the Lord Buddha's teachings. The youth's name wasn't Jesus, it was Issa, but depending on who you ask, Issa and Jesus were one in the same. The document claims that Issa, aka Jesus, crossed Punjab and reached the Jagannath temple in Puri. But his journey was far from over. He traveled to the most remote Tibetan monasteries high in the snowy slopes of the Himalayas, and there he studied Buddhism for the next decade and a half. At the age of 29, Issa left, traveled through Persia, and then returned to his homeland. This story perfectly explains why 18 years of Jesus' life are missing from the Bible. The church didn't want anyone to know their Messiah was secretly a Buddhist. Nor do they want anyone alive today knowing that the founder of Christianity was trying to spread Buddhist ideas. So after Christ's death, the first leaders of the church corrupted his legacy. This can't be proven beyond a shadow of a doubt, but it is surprisingly convincing. Nobody knows where the document from the Hemis monastery is today. Life of Saint Issa, Best of the Sons of Man, was last seen in 1922. Let's just hope the Vatican didn't get their hands on it. Hell is real, and the ancients knew it. Do you remember what your reaction was when you figured out that Mount Olympus was a real mountain in Greece? If you're only finding it out now, I hope your reaction is a good one. Mount Olympus isn't just a place in a fairy tale. It's a real mountain that you can hike. You can physically visit the mountain of the gods. Mount Olympus isn't the only legendary place located on this planet. Italian archaeologists in Turkey recently discovered a gateway to hell, and it's not the only one. Ancient people around the globe believed that hell was a real place, hiding underneath the earth. It's like that song, Heaven's Here on Earth, except the opposite. The incredible discovery was made in the ancient city of Hierapolis, which is called Pamukkale today. Pilgrims came from all over the world 2,000 years ago to bathe in Hierapolis's hot springs. They also worshipped the gods at Plutonian, a temple precinct built above an underground cave network. Archaeologists excavated along the path of the hot springs until they found an entrance to a cavern. It wasn't just a big empty hole leading into the ground. The Greco-Romans made it into a real doorway covered in mystical engravings. Above the entrance is a dedication to Pluto, the Roman god of death. Pluto was the Roman version of Hades. Archaeologists had already known of this gateway because of ancient Greek geographer Strabo. In the final years of the 1st century BC, Strabo wrote of his adventures in Plutonian. He mentioned a gateway to hell, in which any animal that entered would instantly die. Strabo was talking about the very same gate archaeologists just found. But it wasn't the power of hell killing everyone who entered. It was likely poisonous gas seeping from the thermal area beneath. Alright, maybe Plutonian wasn't home to the real entrance to hell. But what about Twins Cave in the Judean hills of Israel just outside Jerusalem? Archaeologists found pagan rituals here linked to the underworld. Ancient sources suggest that Twins Cave was where Persephone, the daughter of Zeus and the wife of Hades, journeyed into the underworld. Or what about in Nicaragua at the Masaya volcano? Spaniards who discovered the volcano in the 16th century called it the mouth of hell. They believed the volcano led to the fiery domain of Satan. Maybe there really is one entranceway somewhere that leads to an infernal domain of eternal torment. But in reality, it's more likely that the church stole these stories of gateways to hell when they started telling their own stories about fire and brimstone. What is the one thing that you're certain the church is lying to everyone about? Let me know in the comments, and thanks a lot for watching. Remember to subscribe and come back soon for more awesome stuff from the channel. I'll see you next time. Bye.